during the week, but I'm going to do it again. It's been an extraordinary conference. In fact, a whole week. Those of us that have been here since the weekend who had the privilege of attending the PhD conference, a short course, intensive course on Tuesday, have just had a banquet of wonderful sort of ideas and projects. And there's a real buzz about this event and the discourse around it. It's something I want to return to at the end of this presentation. It just feels like this is the right place at the right time, and there's a confluence of ideas and people and projects, and there's real potential to change the game in the academy as well as in practice. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk about over the next 45 minutes or so. And you're right, it's a cheeky title, it's a provocation, it's maybe taking us a little bit further than we're all comfortable. But I want to rehearse out loud what maybe the next discourse may sound like, and when maybe we are in that place, what it might look like, and how the logic might work, and what the vocabulary might be, and how we might wire up that community. So it's partly a thesis on what I see as a profound moment of change, but it's also a challenge to all of you that are embarking on these extraordinary projects that we've been hearing about in the last few days, and particularly to those PhD students who are at the beginning of their theses. So there's really sort of two halves to this. I want to focus in on a little bit of a history so that we can get a sense of what it is I'm suggesting is coming to the end. And then I want to, somewhat dangerously, step back from the whole conference and try and pull out some themes for me, and try and give my sense of well, what I'll be taking away, but what I think is emerging from the debates over the last few days. So let's begin with reminding ourselves then of the journey that we've been on as a sector. So my focus very much in this session is on the digital part of transformation. And the way I'm interpreting transformation is how the institution is being transformed. Because in a way, there's two conversations we're having at this event. There is how the institution is transformed itself, but how the transformative qualities of the museum are changing society, changing the experience and lives of those who engage as users and audiences and visitors and so on. And I think through the sessions, we've been using that word in both ways, both the transformative power of the museum, but how the museum itself is being transformed. It might be quite a useful distinction to keep in mind. So this is how I think the institution has been transformed by digital. So this is just my take. This isn't meant to be a sort of dogma on what I'm sort of suggesting we must all sign up to. This is just my personal take on one way of schematizing the arrival of information communication technology into the museum that traditionally has these gallery spaces. So that's what those different shapes signify there. So once upon a time, there weren't computers in museums. Back in the middle of the 20th century, you wouldn't have found digital technology within a museum and a gallery. It was only in the mid-1960s at places like the Smithsonian Institution that we began to explore the potential of what was then called automation. So automating of existing manual processes to make them more efficient or to make them more accurate. And it was in collections management that ICT finally came into the museum during that moment in the 60s. But you wouldn't have found digital media in the public spaces. You wouldn't have found it in the gallery spaces. It wasn't a tool for communicating and conveying to audiences. It wasn't what participation was being predicated upon. Maybe what we'll see later on. It was a powerful new machine for organizing records, for indexing, for cataloging. During the 1980s and 1990s, obviously, we see the web arriving at that moment in the last decade of the 20th century, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we begin to see ICT stepping into the exhibition, the public spaces, the display spaces of the institution. So that's why it's there. It's just overlapping now into the gallery. But when it did so in quite an awkward way. Think of those museums around the world where digital media was given its own micro-gallery or some peripheral space in the institution, as if we were happy to explore and offer this technology as an archiving machine, as a place to find more encyclopedic information and data about the collections on display. But we were less confident allowing that technology to mix with the collection. We were less comfortable with the idea of technology, of the computer, of this thing that had been a machine for the previous 10, 20 years, populating that space with those other established curatorial devices for display and communication. So this is a quite extreme example of booths that are sort of well away from the main exhibition space, where you're allowed to interact with a computer in a safe and sealed place. This idea of the computers at the time, if we think back to what the hardware was like, your beautiful, intuitive, wearable, portable, mobile devices that are wonderful to hold in our hand, and they have a whole fashion around them. Computers used to look like that. They were hot and heavy and tethered and slow and conspicuous and grey, and it meant that they didn't fit in with sometimes the delightful aesthetic that we wanted to present in the gallery space. What we then find in the 1990s is that model of sort of contained new media. We start to find it into the gallery space, but we've allowed it into the exhibition space, into the public spaces of the museum. But it's in a very discrete place. It's very clear where the technology is. Sometimes we were very cruel where we put the technology. In this case, the naughty computer being asked to stand in the corner of the room and reflect upon what it's done to the rest of the exhibition. This is the sense of the technology being obvious and conspicuous and not being embedded within the narrative and the aesthetic of the rest of the exhibition. This is technology as add-on. This is technology where it hasn't been seamlessly sewn into the rest of the experience, the rest of the design, the rest of the aesthetic, the rest of the space. So this is the culture of the kiosk. Even that word, kiosk, it sort of suggests, sort of vending machine or some sort of mechanical device dispensing things in a very sort of functional way. That seemed to encapsulate the way that we were using digital media in those spaces. Typically, there will always be exceptions that I'm sure you can think of, maybe even in your own institutions during that time. But typically, habitually, this was the approach that we were taking at that time. Digital media had made it into the gallery space, but it was still sort of discrete. It was still sort of separate from. You could see the difference between the digital and the non-digital. There was an obvious divide and an obvious join. But then things changed. Around 2000, the turn of the century, we started to see in museums and galleries, and maybe you want to reflect upon your own practice around this time, about sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We started to think about digital media at the beginning of the design process. I've interviewed a number of new media heads and officers in museums about this very point, and it's interesting how you hear again and again these professionals saying, I started to get invited to meetings earlier on in the process I wasn't asked at the end, could you develop a CD, could you develop an interactive for this exhibition that already now has been conceived and signed off, in some cases exists. But the new media teams, the designers who specialize in digital media, were part of that generative moment, that creative, nascent moment at the beginning when the ideas were born and concepts were being mapped out, and narrative and space and object and theme and media and target audience were all being cleverly lined, as we do with an exhibition design. So what we see here is that bubble of ICT starts to scatter itself, because digital media is part of the overall concept. It's another tool in the box the designer is able to use in amongst all the other tools that we use: object and text and image and light and color and space and mechanical interactive and so on and so on. So in some respects, it just meant the technology just started to look better. We started to think about making the technology at least chime and at least harmonize with the materials and the aspect ratios and the proportions and the sizes and the colors of the rest of our exhibit, so they didn't seem ugly and out of place and conspicuous and incongruous. They at least looked as if they belonged there. But we started to place those digital media so that they scattered across those spaces, so that they became a recurring device. They became a familiar device. They were inherent to the overall design. In this case, a music exhibition where almost every instrument has a digital display in front of it that allows the visitor to hear that instrument playing. So in this particular case, the designers from Square One utilized the potential of digital media and the multimedia power of digital media to allow the visitor to hear the instrument. So fundamental to understanding why that object exists and what its function is in the world, to hear the sound and the music of that instrument. We started to blend our screens and our objects and our replicas. There's digital screens, real objects, and models, all in that same image there from a nature and science museum in Tokyo, and sometimes it's difficult to know which is which, and that seems to encapsulate what I'm trying to convey here. At the same time, that relationship with the web became more complex. So rather than the web in the discrete model in the 1990s being something that the museum connected to at a large institutional level for promotion and visitor information, or maybe making the entire collection accessible, what we start to see at the turn of the century is the web has connections to the institution, to particular galleries and exhibits, but maybe to particular interactives and particular objects within those exhibits. So the web is embedding itself and building channels of communication between one object, one interactive, as well as that exhibit and as well as that institution. So we have a more complex relationship with the web that starts to emerge, of course. And I know this is simplifying what is a very complex situation, what was very varied in its time and extent around the world. And I appreciate that in the Science Centre, as opposed to the Discovery Centre, the Sculpture Park, the Art Museum, the Ethnographic Museum, this history played out differently, different speeds with different nuances, but this is a schema to give us a sketch, some landmarks, some markers to allow us to begin to at least think about historicizing new media into the museum. Okay. This is perhaps where we are today. So a couple of things have happened in the diagram there. The blue that's representing information and communication technology, that's representing new media, has now just soaked into the gallery space. It's now embedded within the concept of what an exhibition is. Through museums' histories, they've been confronted with new display technologies. So glass that you can look through, was once a new technology that allowed us to not have a curator unlock a cabinet for a visitor, but allowed a visitor to look at objects by themselves. Lighting, the arrival of gas lighting, allowed us to have a very different relationship to our audiences and when someone visited and what sort of space it could be. Lockable cases in the British Museum in the middle of the 18th century. Drawers, pedestals, labelling, all of these were once new technologies. But now, all of those media, all of those devices are innate within our concept of what an exhibition is. To say exhibition is to say all of those things, is to say pedestal and cabinet and label and emblematic approach. They've become a function of exhibition. And what I'd like to suggest, and I don't think it's too early to say it, I'd like to suggest that now new media has become a function of exhibition as well. It's an innate quality of an exhibition. To think exhibition in the 21st century is, of course, potentially to think of digital media having a place within that exhibition. We don't need to plead a special case to put a computer in a gallery now. We don't need to be technological evangelists to apologize and petition for new media to be placed in the exhibit. To say exhibit is to imply that new media will be involved and will be extant within that place. And by the way, the other interesting thing that's happening in that diagram is the relationship between web and on-site physical gallery has started to merge and converge even more. So the moment that I take your mixed reality, augmented reality app into the Parthenon or the Acropolis, I'm both online and on the web, but I'm also in gallery as well. So we've started to blur the distinction between web and gallery, with that inference that web is always considered to be off-site and distant. Think about what Linda has been saying, and all those other examples we've heard this week of visitors potentially taking their phones or some sort of device into the museum. So we need to revisit that by binary opposition between web and museum, because you can be online and on-site. So the join between the two is now harder to see. It's become smudged in an exciting and creative way. So we've started to design interactives that look less like computers now. So by becoming better at design, by the hardware and software just developing in terms of its size and its speed and the technology behind screens and our ability to have untethered technology and so on, it's allowed us to begin to create digital content within exhibitions where it becomes harder to see whether it's digital or not. Okay, this is an example we can clearly see a screen, but what's happened in this particular maritime museum is the designers said, I won't have a keyboard, I won't have a conventional input device. What we'll have it's a winch, isn't it, on a boat. So by looking at the boat in front of you, you're kind of experiencing that sense of, pulling in the ropes or putting up a sail, and that's the metaphor that's being used to drive this particular digital interactive. Here at the Wellcome Collection in London, the exhibition about Henry Wellcome, this is a digital interactive, but you wouldn't know it. It's just a drawer in a wooden case. But what's actually happening as you stand and you move is that sound is being triggered. So there's digital sound content that's being triggered according to what you do. But there's no screen, there's no keyboard, there's no mouse, there's no drop-down menu, there's no click here. It's just a drawer. But that intuitive, natural action of opening a drawer, knowing how to interact with the world and the affordances of just seeing a drawer handle, that's actually wrapping itself around what is actually a digital interactive. We've become more able and competent and creative and imaginative in the way that we've packaged and skinned and shaped our digital media. Here's two very handsome boys who gave me permission to photograph them, partly because they're my sons. And in this particular case, I don't just drag them around museums and make them use interactive. So this was actually just a fun family day out. But this is in Birmingham, and they were exploring Think Tank in Birmingham, which is an extraordinary sort of science and discovery centre. And because of some reorganisation, it's now part of Birmingham museums just in the last few months, having been an independent organisation before. In this case, these two boys have just been wandering through a particular exhibit which is all about surveillance and the way we watch and are watched in our everyday lives. And they've come across a picnic bench, and there was a sort of Mission Impossible still case on top of it, and actually it played the Mission Impossible. I won't sing it, just too embarrassing. You know the one. Kevin's going to sing it instead. The Mission Impossible kind of music, and as they opened it, it started to sort of pump in with that, and then it gave them a download of a top secret kind of surveillance operation that perhaps they're going to be involved with. It's a bench and it's a case. Okay, there's a very clever game and digital interactive going on, but for these two visitors, they knew what to do. They just sat down at the bench. They were outside in a park, metaphorically, and they were just opening this briefcase, and everything else seemed to follow very naturally. One of the iconic examples, of course, from the last 10 years was the Casson-Mann design for the Churchill Museum in London. So this, whatever it is, 24-foot-long, multi-user interactive touch table, which was Casson-Mann's just exquisite response to the dilemma of having to exhibit a paper archive. What do you do when you have an archive to exhibit? You pin pieces of paper to the wall with very small type that people can't read. So what Casson-Mann, as I'm sure almost all of you know, is they put together this timeline touch table where all a visitor does is run her finger up and down what seems like a leather strip on what just seems like a very substantial sort of 1940s piece of furniture where you can't help but sort of take a Churchillian stance, a cigar in your hand, looking over your battle plans. And as you ride your finger along and pause on a particular date, the archive documents open up. It's a metaphor of a filing cabinet, like you're looking down and running your fingers through a filing cabinet. And as you pause, the documents open in front of you, relating to different parts of the Churchill family's history and lives. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. The moment when someone around the table, because you find yourself catching eyes and talking to 12 other people around a digital interactive that you're all using at the same time, which rarely happens in a museum, where we still tend to privilege the single user, hyper-individualization of the interface still. What happens if somebody chooses Remembrance Day is the whole table floods with poppies. If someone chooses a date related to Wimbledon, the tennis tournament, a tennis ball bounces down the table with sort of 3D sound, and everyone looks up and thinks, well, what's going on here? Or if someone chooses the date related to the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, the table whites out, and everyone is kind of disarmed for a moment, and you stop. And it's quite overwhelming. And that's a moving, passionate experience over a digital interactive. But it shows us how far we've come from the kiosk in the corner of the room to something that is the museum, the defining interactive, the defining exhibit of this iconic figure is a big interactive touch table. But it just feels like a table. Here's another table, and I want to show you a video, if I can. Whoops. This is in the National Museum of Ethnography in Osaka. Has anyone seen this? Okay. It's a table, and there are these beautiful blocks, just wooden blocks, in a lovely, beautiful wooden tray. So the first thing you want to do is go up to the tray and just look at these, almost like little printing blocks. And they're lovely to hold, and they're wooden, and some of them are sort of heavier plastic. And you can hear that noise as they bounce together. It's like a child's toy, or is it a printing press room, or whatever, a wood block printing office. And each one has a different sound on it. And what you do, in Japanese, it's a very complex language where different combinations of sounds create different words. So what this visitor is doing is she's putting different letters and different vowel sounds and different sounds together on the table. And the table's showing her what those different combinations of sounds make. And the table's kind of learning, it's kind of thinking what words it can form. And as it slowly starts to piece the letters together, it realizes that it can make words. It's quite beautiful. Where we go? Where should we stop? There. That's a digital interactive, but you wouldn't know it because you're so lost in the fact that you're handling these every day. Is it a child's toy? Is it a printing device? It doesn't matter. It's just these lovely blocks that you're playing with, and you just put them on a table, and you just begin to think about the language and the linguistics and the sound. Here's another example taking us a little bit further. So if in our design we've become attuned to designing digital interactives that don't look like digital interactives anymore, they look like drawers and tables and suitcases and picnic benches. Here's an example of a couple of examples of us going to the other extreme. Here's a space at the National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation in Tokyo, and I have a video I can show you, I think, of this. I'll turn the sound down because it's me talking to the designer about her intent around it. But what we've got here is the whole space is a digital interactive. It's a game, actually. It's a game where you have to sort of collect certain things as they're moving around the floor, and you go to certain, and the flickering is because the floor looks like it's liquid. And certain creatures and certain objects then start moving around the floor or are going up the walls, and you interact with them. But then can you see, look, there's somebody has got a kind of representation of where they're walking. And as you meet other people, so I go up to Kirsten and she's got a circle around her as well, we do a kind of connection thing. And then we've kind of made friends and we've collected each other. And then when we meet Kim, other things happen. And it's about being in tune with your natural environment, but it's also about socialization. So the whole display, I guess it's an example of a whole exhibit being a digital medium where there's no join between sort of physical and digital. You're completely immersed. It's probably the only example I can think of where you feel utterly immersed within a digital media space. One final example, and then we'll do our last sort of 20 minutes sort of summary of seeing how this connects to the summary of the week. This is in the same museum, so this is this National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation in Tokyo, which is funded handsomely by government. The Japanese government are very proud for this museum to align very strongly to the national brand of Japan being world leaders in technological development and innovation. So it doesn't struggle for funding like some of the other museums in Japan do. That is the largest spherical screen in the world. It's not a projection, it is actually a spherical screen. So the technology is screen technology. And it is, so it's actually a big interactive. It's a big screen. But it is, as you can see, the scale of it, there's a balcony that sort of circles around it. And it's the way that the museum then engage with questions around our planet and climate and environmental change and so on. It's an interactive because this guy here, he works for the museum and he's controlling it live on his iPad. So it's the biggest TV screen in the world, and that guy, he's got a microphone on, he's chatting to people around him, and anyone who wants to ask him a question, his voice is going around the entire auditorium, and he's running the show. It's not just a kind of pre-scripted, it just runs. Ever since the dawn of time, man has wanted to fly, and you'll just sit there and watch. He's actually scripting and taking us through that particular event as it needs to be sort of conducted on that particular day with that particular audience. And he's running it from that iPhone in his hand. The other brilliant thing about it is you can lie underneath it. There's a space underneath this big globe where you just chill out, and there's these, kind of benches. There's also, beanbags, and people just take off their shoes. And I've never seen sort of families and individuals just sort of lying on the floor in a museum, kicking off their shoes and just lying there. And some people had gone to sleep, and but it was just beautiful. Again, you forget digital, you forget computer, you forget the word interactive. No one was saying new media. It was just a stunning, enthralling, immersive, beguiling, beautiful, delightful museum experience where it's hard to see any distinction between analog and digital and where the join is. And that's how far we've come. There are screens and interactives around it. Final example. This is the Tree of Life exhibit in the National Museum of Nature and Science, also in Tokyo. And this is an example where objects are present as well. This is a almost circular room, and there's objects from the museum collection all the way around the wall. But the floor is a kind of live floor. So as you sit at one of the tables or one of the benches and you start exploring, I want to know about dangerous Australian frogs, which seems to be one of our themes and motifs this week. If I want to find out about dangerous Australian frogs, then from my interactive, from the bottom of my terminal, a flood of connections will go across the floor and will take me to the collection. It's like a wiring diagram of how the collections are connected. It's a three-dimensional mind map that you can then explore and walk along the lines to find the piece of the case and the object that relate to what you were exploring. Again, it's an example of an extraordinary melding of digital and non-digital. And you don't care whether it's digital or not, or where the join is. It's just a compelling, enthralling, magnificent exhibition. So that is where I think we're going next. It's where digital media is just innate. And we may even look back on the fact that we talked about something called digital heritage, that we decided to put it in a box, that we decided to treat it differently. It'll become innate to our thinking, to our organisation, and to our research methodologies and our design, so that it's just an innate function within what museum is. That noun museum, that verb to museum will involve possibly sometimes doing things using one of these technologies that we have in front of us, one of which might be digital. And we won't feel compelled to keep talking about digital as different. We will know its power, and we'll know why it can do things that other media at our disposal can't do, but we won't isolate it and make it discrete and consider it on its own in quite the way that we're doing now. So we've come a long way from ICT not being in the institution all the way to the point where digital media is now an element of museum. So it's words like, embedded in innate and invisible that I think are the more appropriate lexicon to use to describe digital media's relationship with this institution. So what we've heard this week is how in-gallery media and web media are becoming more pervasive, how they're becoming more participatory, that magic word of the week, and how they're becoming more personalized. So let me try and make sense of that for the themes of the conference. So this is my last kind of sort of 5-10 minutes, if that's all right. So this has made my head hurt a little bit thinking this through. So this may not be in any way correct or helpful, but it's my attempt at taking the main themes of the conference, transformation in organization, transformation in communication, transformation in participation, and transformation in those methodologies, those research methodologies, and to think about what I've seen and heard this week and what I can see in the abstracts for today, what they're speaking to in terms of digital media in particular. So the question is, in terms of organization, digital media has become, well, I think one thing that we've seen this week is that digital media has become articulated within institutions' vision and mission. Those of you that are talking about your institution's commitment now to digital media, Linda Kelly's sort of the extreme example of this, of an organization that sees its website as important as its physical gallery, and those examples she gave of Tate and those other institutions around the world now that see themselves as multi-channel organizations, multi-site, multimodal, a word we've heard in several sessions, institutions. So digitality is now within the grammar, within the strategic grammar. I don't mean as a word, I mean as a sort of concept, sort of shaping the logic of how we say what we do, what we are, who we are for, where we are, when we are. Digitality has now percolated into that rhetoric of mission and vision. So it's become, I think, sort of familiar. Digital media has also become incorporated into the institution's shape and workflow. It was interesting hearing the papers around communities of practice and around the building of some particular interactives. I'm thinking of Pile's paper yesterday where you were talking about who was in the room, the designers, the curators, the developers, the users. We're starting to digitality is affecting the way that we work and who works together. And that model of having an IT department, okay, IT may still look after the cables and the network and the email, but even having a new media department seems a little bit as not the most de rigueur of organizational shapes to have. What we're seeing now is new media being across the institution in lots of different places. It's there in education, it's there in the registry, it's there in conservation, it's there in marketing. It's not a discrete unit in its own right, it's everywhere, it pervades. And that's true for the people who work in the museum as well, who more and more, and again it was interesting listening to you this week talk about the skill sets that are required from your curators. But more and more, we're seeing mixed portfolios of responsibility, but also skill sets within our museum professionals that include digital. And certainly the curricula that we put together at Leicester and many other training providers are putting together around the world are about generating 21st century museum professionals who have this new media curiosity and have this digital literacy and these digital competencies within them. And that's part of the standard skill set that you leave a museum training course on today. So as well as familiar and embedded, then there's this sense of complementary. Digital is complementing those other things those other skills we already have. Thinking about that communication strand, digital media has become, well, as we saw from the diagram I was just showing, it's become innate. and it's become established. So it's a familiar thing now within our communication strategies. It's intuitive. Think of the drawers and the tables and the desks and the big planet, and it's become inconspicuous. A line I like to use quite a lot and probably use too much. With digital media, we'll use it more and more. We'll just notice it less and less. And I think that sense of the digital becoming invisible, even though we may be using it much more and in more sophisticated ways, is a tribute to how cleverly we're designing it and how intuitively the interface is and so on. But what we've heard a lot of this week is that digital media is also blending with the everyday, and your augmented reality app and the other augmented reality projects we heard about earlier on in the day tell us about how we don't have to make a decision anymore about whether we're going to be digital or not. It's not this is the bit that's digital and this is the bit that's not. Here's the kiosk, here's the interactive, and now here's the stuff which is printed and about objects. There's much more of a blend. Those of you that are starting your museum careers, or those of you that are engaging and making these decisions day to day in the museum, it's not a choice anymore. It's a balance. It's about how much digital and what the mix between the two will be. And it's mobile, so it's how that mix happens within the everyday. When the museum decides to just pop up and tweet you, or be a fragment of information as you're walking along the street, or be part of your classroom lesson, there's that kind of mix and that kind of blend as well. Just looking at these last two areas then, in terms of participation, digital media has also become orthodox and defining. What I mean by that is it's hard today in museum practice and museology to say participation, to think about participation in the museum without in some way thinking about digital as well. And I think I say defining because I think, and I want to come on to this in the last line, I think the work that you are doing, many of you are doing with digital participation or using social media and digital technology to enable participation in the museum, I think that's affecting the museum's general sense of what participation can be and what it is. So the research, the thinking, the ideas that are coming from digital heritage around participation are actually affecting museology more generally. The activity that the web team is doing around social media in the museum is actually changing the game for the institution generally about their relationship with their audiences and how audiences can participate. It's an exciting example of how digital is affecting the non-digital in a way. That concept is being shaped because of ideas and practice that are happening in digital contexts. Digital has also become a channel into the everyday. It's the way in which we can become part of someone's life outside of the institution. And it's a means to I'm sorry about the language here, I've got to find better words to describe this, but to escort the flaneur. So we don't have that traditional model of someone just coming to the institution. The museum can come to you when you need it. So as I'm walking through the city, as I'm walking through my life and making sense of the world, as I walk through the everyday, the museum can be with me when I need it and how I need it. So digital media has become has allowed us to have a very different relationship with our audiences in that way. Finally, let's think about that final strand then, that sense that the way that we're doing research about digital media has changed. So all of those things are what I've seen this week. They're what you have said in those PhD papers and in the conference so far. So that's your vocabulary up there. In terms of research methodology, I think it's really important that we allow ourselves the opportunity to break away from an existing set of research questions. And I'm partly to blame here, because a lot of my research over the last 10 years has been about adoption. Writing histories of how we have got here and what is new about this technology and how is this different. we need to, and what's clear from the research that you're doing, is you currently now are doing research around digital media that's more about just adoption discourse. But we need, and I think I'm seeing evidence this week that in fact we need to challenge ourselves to ask research questions that are more than just questions that start, what is the opportunity of, or testing this technology, or about something being new. We cloak so much of our digital heritage research around neoteric discourse, around the fact that this is change, this is new, this is paradigm shift, this is different. And it locks us into a certain logic. It locks us into a certain process of argumentation about then and now and future, or about old and new, or about difference, or about progression. And it means a lot of our reference points for, I was going to write them on the wall, but maybe we'll talk about them afterwards. A lot of our reference points, our theoreticians are familiar theoreticians, whether it's people referring to Thomas Kuhn and paradigm shift, or Walter Benjamin and a shift in mechanical reproduction, or McLuhan was mentioned yesterday, or it's Castells telling us that we're in an information society, or it's Jan van Dijk's network society, or it's Lev Manovich telling us this is new media, it is different in these ways, and therefore it will affect us. The bookshelf that we go to is dominated by theoreticians who are talking about newness and adoption and shift. And we've got an opportunity to now reach for another bookshelf that might be, well, we also heard about Bourdieu, and we heard about Foucault, and we heard about persuasive design, and we've heard about a whole bunch of other theoreticians that are not about justifying or apologizing for new media or understanding what's new and that we're in a profound moment of change and that everything's going to be different, but they accept that we have it now. It's here. It's naturalized in what we do. It's embedded. It's innate. So let's now open our minds to many other theoretical reference points and assumptions on which we can predicate our research. What was so delightful about Tuesday and hearing one PhD presentation after another is that the generation that are coming through now are doing this already and are probably wondering what on earth I'm talking about. I want to just put a marker down to say this is a point of change. You are asking a fresh set of questions. The way you are conceiving and framing your projects is very much over here. It's about what can we do. How does this work? How does access work? What about participation? What about involvement? What about delight? What about where the museum is? Rather than being locked into a set of research questions that are about something new appearing. And what I also call for, and again what I think I'm also seeing this week, is that we're allowing ourselves to use non-digital theory to write about digital heritage. So those of you that are reaching for anthropology, reaching for sociology, reaching for cultural studies, reaching for pedagogy, and don't feel that you have to start a discussion about digital media by, citing good, solid digital media theoreticians. That's going to allow us to just expand our horizon. And then the final point, and then I really will stop. The final point is our potential in digital media and digital heritage studies to affect everything. It's that sense I gave before that what we're doing around participation, what you're doing around participation when you think about digital, that has consequences for the whole of the sector and the whole of museology and those practitioners and researchers who are not working with digital. And that's exciting. Up until now, we've put digital in a silo, so digital outcomes only get to affect digital life in the museum. Now what we're allowing ourselves to do is that the outcomes from digital research and practice are being valued right across the museum, its study and its practice. I think there's also, finally, one thing about understanding how digital logic or researching around digitality might influence the way we think about research more generally. It might be that the types of theoretical approaches you're taking, the forms of argument, think about what Kirsten was saying yesterday about humanities models and a logic of arguing, and that the ways that you are bringing different sequences of arguments to museology may allow us to find new ways of exploring and articulating the subject. So for me, I think it's interesting that there's a whole bunch of things across our main themes this week that are to do with digital media becoming more familiar, more naturalized. I think there's a bunch of things to do with digital media becoming embedded. So as well as the fact that we see digital media and we don't blink in the institution, it's also genuinely embedded into our methodologies, our participatory models, our communication and organizational structure. And it is complementing. It is no longer a choice. It's an as well as. It is a blend. It is a mix. You are both things. And that's why augmented reality is such a brilliant metaphor for all of this. So those three words at the top there could be turned into naturalized, ambient, and augmented, which are the kind of three words that I'm finding myself gravitating towards at the moment. And I think as three words, they'd be the big three words that I'd take away from this week. I think new media has become naturalized into our operation, into our thinking, into our research, into our design. It's now ambient in our workplace and within our exhibition environments and within the everyday lives of our audiences. And it augments, it adds to, it blends with the analog actual world. It's not a compartment of it or a silo of it or an adjunct to it. It's an augmentation of it. And that's why I think we've come to the end of the beginning of digital heritage. Thank you very much.